This is the second part of the diagnostic class for insects for the 2020 Colorado Master Gardener Program or supplement, if you're interested. This is a discussion on how we can see what's been on the plant or tell what's been on the plant by the pattern of injury that's been left behind or the leavings, the kind of secreted or excreted material that they leave behind. So in this case, these are, we're going to be talking about the ones that suck fluids. The previous one was on insects that chew. And there is a handout that goes along with both of these that I can make available to you. So insects, again, in review, basically will feed in either one, two primary ways. They're going to be feeding on solid material with chewing mouthparts, or they're going to feed on a liquid diet using some sort of sucking mouthpart. And the types of bugs, a broad sense, that will feed on plant fluids would be all the insects in the order Hemiptera. This is a huge order, very important. Includes aphids and scale insects and whiteflies and mealybugs and the true bugs and leafhoppers and lots of things. One of the more important groups of insects that feed on plants. Then there is the thrips. We don't usually get to talk about the thrips, but a very big order in terms of abundance, very small insects. And then there's mites. There's a couple different kinds of mites that will feed on plants, such as the spider mites and the rust mites. So there's a couple of things that come along with having a sucking mouth part and feeding on fluids, and that is that insects and mites are going to usually produce a liquid waste. Now, there's going to be one exception I'll get to in just a sec, but generally it's going to be liquid, and it'll be a solid waste if they feed on solid material. But another thing that is going to show up with these insects and the mites is that you can see their old skins, the old when they discard after molting, and in review, all arthropods, insects, mites, crustaceans, everything has to periodically get rid of their exoskeleton in order to grow, because the exoskeleton confines how big you can be. So all of these things will be one size. They'll shed the old skin and inflate to the next size in this process called molting. And here we see a couple of insects that are in the process of molting. There's a cicada adult that's emerging from the nymphal skin, the last stage nymph, and there's a sequence of a squash bug nymph molting from its skin, its old exoskeleton. Here's a grasshopper, and it's molting from its exoskeleton. And in the picture on the right is a nymph and an old skin. Now, grasshoppers are one of the groups of insects that feed with chewing mouthparts. And you would be you'd be hard pressed, and it would be uncommon for a skin of an insect that has chewing mouthparts to be left behind because they eat it. They usually turn around and consume it with their chewing mouthparts. The insects we're talking about here can't chew. So here we see an aphid that is stepping out of her old skin, and she can't turn around and feed on that because she has mouthparts that can only suck fluids. So these are left behind. So this is a big diagnostic. If you have insects or spider mites that feed on fluids, then the cast skins will be left behind. And so sometimes that will be a tip-off on what has been on the plant. Again, you see these all the time with insects that feed with sucking mouthparts. You rarely see them if they have chewing mouthparts. So again, these cast skins, these discarded exoskeleton remnants, are sometimes very useful for diagnosis. These little white things that are in these two pictures would be something that could be used to help figure out what has been on that plant. And then there is a secreted product that's produced by insects that feed with sucking mouthparts, at least some of them, and that's wax. We talked about silk being produced by caterpillars, and there are some other insects that produce a little bit of silk, maybe for producing a cocoon around the pupa. But wax is something you are going to see produced by insects that feed on the fluids of the phloem. So there's going to be different sites where these animals are going to be feeding, on the fluids, and if they are phloem feeders, like an aphid would be, or a mealybug, uh, then they may produce wax because the wax would be the extra sugar that is in that part of the plant. And instead of just excreting it, they convert it into wax. And it may cover their body or may cover the area around them. But if you see wax, that's some sort of insect with sucking mouth parts that feeds on the phloem. It may appear as a fine covering of the body. So the picture on the right, that's an aphid, cabbage aphid, and that is one that produces fine flocculent wax all over the back of its body. There's a kind of scale insect called a felt-like scale insect, European elm scale. It's got a little bit of wax over its body. And the white on the wings of a whitefly, that's wax. So these are all insects that feed on the phloem fluids. And sometimes they will convert this to wax that's very long and so long that it may completely obscure the body. So there's insects on conifers, aphids that feed on conifers called the adelgids. They're a woolly type of aphid, and there's woolly type of aphids sometimes you'll see on deciduous plants, notably the woolly apple aphid would be the big example. But these again are all phloem feeders. There's a family which we usually don't talk about much in this class because most of them are tropical and subtropical, but the mealybugs, and they cover their body with wax, and they will often produce a waxy sac in which they'll lay the eggs. So that's one that might produce perhaps more wax than uh, most anything else. And sometimes you'll see underground insects that suck on the fluids of the from the roots, and they will also often surround themselves with wax, though presumably in this site the wax helps keep the moisture off them. But sometimes you'll pull a plant up and from the ground, and it will have this kind of cottony material, and that's wax. And you see that there's aphids in there somewhere. There's also a few insects that will excrete wax. So when I said that the insects that feed on fluids will produce a liquid waste, this is the exception. There's a couple of insects, and we don't have very many of them. They're both in a family called the psyllids, and their waste is converted into wax. So, in the most important example on the left there, we have an insect called the potato tomato psyllid, one of the most important insects on vegetable crops around here. It can be very damaging to potatoes and tomatoes. It produces a kind of waste product that is absolutely unique. It comes out in the form of little wax coated sugary pellets. It kind of looks like granulated salt or sugar. Nothing else does that. And that's a spot on useful diagnostic for the presence of that insect, the potato tomato psyllid, on a crop, at least on an indoor crop where it accumulates. Outdoors, it gets blown off. And then this picture in the upper right is a fairly rare insect, but it is a local example of a psyllid, this one on wild currant, that excretes its waste in the form of long, waxy coils. Very unique. There's other psyllids that do this in other places, like the boxwood psyllid in the eastern U.S. So, getting into the kind of animals we're talking about that feed on plant fluids, the majority and most of the important ones are in the order Hemiptera, and that would be the aphids and the scale insects and the true bugs and the leaf hoppers. But there are also the thrips that will feed on the fluids of the plant, and then spider mites and also other plant feeding mites. So let's start with the way that the mouth parts work in Hemiptera. They have what is called piercing, sucking mouth parts. So the mouth parts are going to be formed into a long stylet that will go into the plant, and it'll be nested in supporting structure, uh, and it gives them a beak. So these are insects that will have a beak. They won't have anything to chew, but they'll have a beak of some kind. It may be a big beak off the very front of the head. It may be a small little peg coming out from the bottom of the body, going that can rest on the surface of the plant. and then the mouth parts go in. But the beak you see is almost entirely made up of supporting structures for the actual mouth parts that go into the plant. Now, going back a little bit to what we talked about with the chewing insects, mentioned the mouth parts of a chewing insect, and talk about the basic four parts with the labrum, the little flap on the front of a grasshopper, and the labium on the underside. And in between, there's a pair of mandibles that are used to chew, and there's a pair of maxillae that are used to manipulate the food and to taste and touch and to move the food into the mouth, where it can be processed by the mandibles and then pushed back in. Well, these insects that we're talking about here have all of those structures, but they are totally transformed into different forms. So the maxillae and the mandibles, they become extremely elongated, and they form a stylet bundle that is nested in mostly the labium, which becomes this big supportive part of the uh, mouth parts. So most of what you'll see would be a greatly extended and developed labium with these paired uh, mouth parts inside, and they are paired. So uh, the picture I think on the right shows this well. So there's an insect with its long beak uh, off the indicated there, and in the very center of that are the actual stylets that are what are used to go into the plant and extract fluids from it. And those stylets are of four parts. There's going to be two mandibles on the outside, and then there's going to be two interlocking maxillae on the inside. And the mandibles, they will work to cut into the plant and move the direction of the mouth parts once it gets into the plant. And the uh, uh, maxillae, the two maxilla, will then form an interlocking structure that has a food canal to take the fluids out of the plant, and then a salivary canal that can put fluids into the plant. So again, you're going to see some sort of beak on these things. It may be prominent, maybe less prominent, maybe off the front, maybe underneath the body. And the mouth parts are nested in that, and they go into the plant to some tissue, depending on what they're going to be accessing. So in the case of an aphid here, we see an aphid in the upper left, and she's got her beak on the proboscis on the surface, and within that are the stylets. And the picture on the right shows a cutaway of a different aphid, but you can see the beak and the surface of the leaf there, and then that track of the stylets going into the plant. So that little track you can see is actually um, a salivary canal or salivary plug, and the stylets were actually even thinner than that. Um, and again, those stylets are going to be a four-part, two mandibles on the outside, two maxillae on the inside. So, what kind of symptoms do we see with piercing sucking mouth parts in Hemiptera? Well, there's a whole range depending on how they feed. And the plant response to feeding depends on how the insects use their mouth parts and where they're going to feed on the plant. And different insects and mites will feed on in different parts of the leaf. So, and they may use their mouth parts in different ways. So let's get into that. So some are going to be feeding by extracting fluids from the phloem. Some are going to be feeding on fluids from the xylem. Some of them are going to feed on the cell contents of the uh, parenchyma and or some of the epidermal cells, but they puncture the cells. And then there's what are called flat lacerate and flush feeding, and that's the most destructive. So let's talk about lacerate and flush feeding. That is a kind of injury that you're going to see with insects that are in the group we call the true bugs. Um, those are things like the harlequin bug and the squash bug and various stink bugs, box elder bug as well, and a group we call the plant bugs. And these are all ones that will feed in a lacerate flush way. And how that works is they have their mouth parts that go into the plant, but how it functions is to destroy cells. It's a weapon. It is the mouth parts will lacerate cells. They'll be poking and breaking and poking and breaking cells and poking and breaking cells. And they break a lot of cells with the physical action of the mouth part. And then they throw in a lot of saliva that digests it. And they then slurp it all up. And it's called lacerate and flush. And every place they feed is a dead area. So here is a group of squash bugs, for instance, on a squash leaf. These would be nymphs for the most part, and you'll see dead areas where they have been feeding, or at least a light area where the tissues have been killed. And if they were to feed on, say, stems or go damage tissues deeply and disrupt the xylem, then the leaves will wilt at that point. So this is a highly destructive way to use the piercing sucking mouth parts. And squash bugs would be an example. There's another group of insects we call the plant bugs. Kind of a lame name, but it is a family. And the plant bugs also feed in a piercing sucking mouth parts in a lacerate and flush manner. So they will damage every place they feed. Now, often plant bugs will feed on developing tissues, so they will preferentially go for maybe a flower bud or new leaves as they come out. Uh, but wherever they feed will be killed. And I think this picture in the upper left shows this pretty well. This is a symptoms of an insect called the four-line plant bug, which we don't have here in Colorado, but is found in the Midwest. And on that cucumber leaf in the upper left, you can see every place where this insect fed, there is these water-soaked dead areas. So those are tissues that were damaged in the process of a single feeding event, and then later those will dry out. In a picture on the lower right, that's a woody shrub that had four-line plant bug injury earlier, and you can see how it's kind of calloused over in those points. But anyway, that's evidence of lacerate and flush feeding. Honey locust plant bug is probably one of the more common ones we have around here, and it is going to be feeding primarily on the new growth. So this one comes out when the new shoots are coming out in May and June, and it feeds mostly on the young leaves. And if it's a very small young leaf, it will kill it. A single event will kill that leaflet. If it's out a little further, it may only kill part of it. And then the leaflet will still be there, but it will be growing in a distorted way that will have some spots on it, or it will curve because the area that was killed doesn't grow, and the living tissues continue to grow, causing the leaf to curl and distort. So, plant bug damage that I just showed you the um, on the honey locust example can produce a slight curling of the leaves. That is one thing that could produce a curling of the leaves. But if we're going to see leaves curl, almost always it is not plant bugs. You see real tight curls. Uh, think aphids. That is by far the most common cause of a leaf curl. Now, not all aphids can cause leaves to curl. Not all aphids, not an aphid may not be able to curl the leaves on all the plants it feeds on, but some aphids on some plants will cause very tight curling of the new growth. It can only do this when the new leaves are coming out. The leaves will often stay green, at least for quite a while. They are not destroying cells that they feed, but there are effects on the actively growing leaves, either through removal of the sap or by um, introducing chemicals in their saliva that causes the growing leaf to come out in this distorted way. And of course, once it's fully out and curled, it will never uncurl. So sometimes we'll see some pretty extreme examples. Probably the most dramatic of the leaf curling aphids I see is one that gets on various plums, and it may so totally twist the leaves in late spring that the leaves become almost unrecognizable. And then others produce less common or less dramatic kinds of leaf curls, like the black cherry aphid on the tart cherries. It's a curl, but not a really tight curl usually. Uh, Another example that has even a more modest kind of curl is one that is on the currant bush, particularly red lake currants, where it's just kind of a puckering. So it's even a really modest curl of any kind. So you get a puckering, and with this insect, it often also turns red, uh, a reaction to their feeding. This may occur also on uh, garden plants as well. So a plant that historically I've had issues with that curled is dill, and partially to some degree, and that's the carrot willow aphid that does that. One final thing showing the leaf curling, in this case on snowball plant. The young leaves coming out are curled. The leaves in the middle of the plant here, they're curled. Again, there were lots of aphids at the time these leaves are coming out. And then leaves after that, they're not quite so curled. So there are very few aphids, or the leaf got ahead of the aphids. And then at the end, there's perfectly good looking leaves that don't seem damaged at all. And that's when the aphid was gone from the plant, either was killed by natural enemies or dispersed to its summer host. Now, moving on to a new subject. This is called stippling, and this occurs where the insects are going to be feeding on the contents of individual cells in the mesophyll. So they are going to be uh, using piercing mouthparts to enter into a cell, kill the cell, extract the fluids from the cell, and then consume it, leaving an empty cell, which is reflected then in a white spot, a light spot, and that is stippling. So again, different insects may feed in different sites. So what we're talking about now are, excuse me, uh, what we're talking about now are things that are going to be feeding here in the mesophyll, the parenchyma cells. They may feed some on the epidermal cells, but most of these are going to be feeding on the parenchyma cells of the mesophyll and emptying them. And because they're emptied, they don't have chlorophyll, and they're going to turn a light color. Now, one group that can do this are certain leafhoppers. Now, leafhoppers are a group we never get to talk about in Master Gardener, but they're a very common kind of family of insects. You can find them on lots of plants. There's leafhoppers everywhere. They're in your lawns, they're on your herbs. There's leafhoppers everywhere, small wedge-shaped insects that are bigger than an aphid, but a relative, and they can fly, the adults, and they hop off the plant and fly. Where I see them most commonly is when I'm walking across the lawn. There's little things I kick up, and those are usually leafhoppers. Anyway, leafhoppers are uh, a big family, and they have a wide range of habits, and there's many things they can do to plants indirectly, like transmitting some disease, pathogens that produce disease. But if we're just talking now about feeding, leafhoppers can feed in different ways. There are some that are phloem feeders. There are some that are xylem feeders, and then there are some that remove fluids from the cells of the mesophyll, the stipplers. So I would say that the most common cause of stippling injury that I see in my garden is caused by leafhoppers. That's my default diagnosis, that it was some sort of leafhopper. So, for example, there's one that's called the white apple leafhopper, and it's going to be an apple and crabapple, little white spots. And if the insect is still there, you flip it off over, flip the leaf over, and you might see the little insects themselves, and they are white, or the old cast skins. Um, a close relative of this is the rose leafhopper. This one's only on rose very early in the year, and then goes to fruit trees actually later. So it'll appear as white spots on the leaves, and then you'll see the nymphs, or maybe the old nymphal skins that are left behind on the underside. On Virginia creeper, sometimes I've seen a huge amount of injury, lots of flecking, lots of white, sometimes completely bleaching the plant. There's so many. And a very similar kind of injury with a related kind of leafhopper on grape. Grape and Virginia creeper share a lot of the same kind of insects. So in the picture on the right, this happens to be one of the grape leafhoppers. And you can see an adult on the left, and there's two nymphs on the right of this picture. And these are all feeding in a way that empties the contents of the cells So you get a white spot. But also in that picture on the lower right, there's all these dark bubbles or dark blobs, and that is their excrement. So this is very distinctive of leafhoppers who feed on the mesophyll. They leave behind these little dark blobs of excrement, and these, of course, may smear on the plant, but little dark spots are very distinctive kind of material that is produced by a mesophyll feeder, and these are called tar spots. So some leafhoppers, the ones that feed on the mesophyll, they'll produce tar spots. Other insects that feed on the mesophyll, they'll produce tar spots. One example of a group that does this, and very distinctive, is a family of bugs called the lace bugs, and they get their name because they have a very unusual appearance that's sort of lacy. Not not to mix these up with lace wings. These are lace bugs. They're in the order Hemiptera. Um, and there's a, a few kinds of lace bug issues we have around here. I see them sometimes on hackberry in southeast Colorado. I see them on chokecherry, sometimes Canada thistle, but they're not very common. Elsewhere, lace bugs are key pests. You go to the mid-Atlantic states, azalea lace bug, rhododendron lace bug, key pests in the landscape because those plants are widely grown. Anyway, lace bugs are ones that are very easy to diagnose because they leave these tar spots behind. So you're going to see on the upper surface of a plant that has lace bug injury, the kind of stippling that we're talking about, little white spots because those cells have been emptied. Those are found on the upper surface. And then you go to the undersurface and they are excreting these little dark spots of excrement, these tar spots. So when you look at uh, a leaf that has injury by the some kind of lace bug, it's extremely distinctive. You'll see lots of little dark spots on the underside of the leaf. And you might see old skins that they leave behind, as well as living stages. But few insects leave such distinctive diagnostic signs behind as do lace bugs. And then there's some other bugs that suck fluids that might feed more or less in the same way. So thrips are a group of insects that we haven't ever spent any time on in Master Gardener, and they feed on plant fluids, but they feed in a totally different manner. They have mouth parts that are modified in a different way. The mandible is reduced to only one. One of the mandibles is missing, and it is in the form of a stout spike that is used to break through the epidermis. The maxillae are like the little swords. They don't work together. They may work separately to break cells. And then the other parts of the mouth part, the labium and the labrum, together form a cone that is pressed on the surface of the plant. So the mandibles break through this epidermis and break through the cells. This maxillae further break the cells, and then it sucks it all up through the cone produced by the remaining parts of the mouth part. So they puncture, poke, and suck. So there's that little cone on the underside of a thrips, and the mouth parts are nested in that the one mandible and the two maxillae. And again, they use this in this manner to puncture with the mandible, poke and break cells with the maxillae, and then suck it all up by having the remainder part of the cone on the surface. So thrips are going to usually be feeding in the immature stage. They've got a complicated life cycle, and they've got two stages that feed and two stages that then don't feed, and then you have an adult. But anyway, most feeding is going to be done by the young stages because they feed most heavily. And you can see that the area that they have fed is similarly stippled. So it's a light area. They've emptied the cell contents. They're another stippler. Furthermore, they leave little solid liquid waste in the form of little dark droplets. So it might be black or dark green. So you have silvery areas, plus you have the little dark spots. That is a real good cue. You have thrips. So silvery scars, small dark fecal spots. Now these are tiny insects. Um, uh, but I will, you know, almost always see the damage, and that's what will make me want to look closer. But I need to look very closely, and it would help sometimes to have a little magnification to actually see the thrips, particularly the immature stages, the first stage and maybe the second stage. Adults, I can see them unaided eye, but the little ones are there. These are small insects. But anyway, that combination, silvery areas on the leaf, silvery scarring with the little dark fecal spots, that's a good tip off you've got thrips. So again, a different kind of stippling injury. The leaf on the upper left, I think maybe you can perhaps see a few of the nymphs on there. There's a nymph there, and there's a nymph there. Uh, so very small on this leaf. So different kinds of thrips. A couple that are quite important: onion thrips, western flower thrips, but there's a separate thrips on gladiolus, and there's a bean thrips I see on baptisia, the false indigo. And then the other group that is going to feed and produce stippling injuries are spider mites. Now, spider mites aren't insects, and they have different structures that they of their body, including the mouth parts. So they don't have the mandibles and they don't have the maxillae, but they have structures called chelicerae. And the chelicerae and the spider mites are modified in order to flail cells and break cells, and then they suck up the released fluids. So kind of whip-like chelicerae that break the cells, and typically at a feeding spot, they might destroy a couple of dozen cells and then extract the fluid that is released from breaking those cells. And then they move on and do it again. So I've always thought of spider mites is how they feed, like rototill and suck. Anyway, it works for me, but I think of little tiny whips, little rototill breaking the cells and then sucking the fluids up. In the picture here on the right, we have clover mites on a grass leaf, and they're kind of working down along the veins. So you're seeing these long areas where it's pale colored following along the vein, but it may be more scattered on the leaf. So on a regular broadleaf plant, spider mite injury may be all over the plant in the form of little tiny flecks. And then if it's more advanced, it becomes off color, may change color quite a bit. But it just looks off. I mean, spider mite injury looks wrong. And, when you see the little flecking and the off color, that's something that you should always be aware of as a symptom of something that has been pretty advanced by that point with spider mites. Again, high populations, the stippling injuries may cover the entire leaf, like that eggplant in the upper left. And if this is happening, you're losing a lot of photosynthetic ability of the plant, so it's not going to yield as well. In some cases, the leaves are killed; they'll just turn brown and die if they're too much. But there's a whole range in how much they may damage a plant. Now, uh, one thing about spider mites is that although they're small, they leave some good signs behind. And the way a spider mite will develop is fairly normal, where it's going to have an egg and then it's going to have immature stages, a larva, a protonymph, a deutonymph, and then finally it's an adult. All pretty straightforward, a little bit different from insects, but mostly the same. But one of the things about the spider mites, is starting with the eggs, is the size of the eggs. So here they've got males and they have females, and there's a female that has produced an egg, and this picture on the left here are several females with several eggs, and these are, I think, just extraordinarily large. I mean, a female spider mite is producing 3, 4, 5 young of these eggs per day, and they are huge compared to the body size. When you look at any other kind of uh, arthropod, I mean, insect eggs aren't nearly as big compared to the size of the mother. And they're producing multiple ones of these every day. And then when the eggs hatch, the shell stays intact. So it still looks it's still there. These giant beach balls all over the leaf. So they're going to leave cast skins, and the picture in the upper left shows the old skins, because these can't chew. They leave the cast skins behind. They're often tucked around the um, midribs of a plant where it's a little more sheltered. And then you might all these little balls, all these little dots. So even if a spider mite is not on the plant, you should be able to see evidence that it had been on the plant, confirming it. Of course, the little flecking injuries it causes is what should first attract your attention. Okay, now a fairly minor situation are insects that feed on the xylem. Uh, to feed on the xylem, it takes a lot of work. If you're feeding on the xylem, you have to pull it out of the plant. And the material that is in the xylem is much more watery than what we're going to get if you feed on the phloem, which is the one we'll talk about next. And so there are not a lot of insects that feed on the xylem, but there are a couple. And perhaps the most dramatic would be spittlebugs. Spittlebugs are insects that use the waste fluid from the xylem, this watery material, then mix it with a little bit of mucousy binder, if you will, and they form little bubbles that surround them. So in the pictures on the left is the spittlebug on a spittlebug mass that has the developing insect within it on a juniper. And one on the lower part is one that's on rabbit brush. There's some that are on flowers, deciduous flowers. Anyway, the young stages, if you were to pull away that little spittle mass, the picture on the upper left, I pulled it away a little bit, and you can see the young stage that's inside that. So they are one of the few insects that feed on the xylem, and they then use the watery waste to create this bubble mass. And then the other group are a group of leafhoppers. The leafhoppers that feed on the xylem we call sharpshooters. Um, and they have a big enlarged area on the front of the head, and I think this shows it best in that picture in the middle. And the reason it's quite enlarged, and you also see this with the spittlebugs too, is it is highly muscled. It's a pump, so they need a lot of pumping to pull the fluid out of the xylem. So kind of have got a little pointy head on these sharpshooter types of leafhoppers, the xylem feeders, and then they will produce this liquid waste. And the liquid waste is then flung off. So the reason they're called sharpshooters is they shoot the little droplets, the little watery droplets. They're not letting it drop straight down. No, they flick it. So if you got in your face right next to a leaf full of lots of leaf hoppers that were the sharpshooter type, and get a few inches away, you might feel like a little light rain on your face. Might want to try that someday. Uh, so leafhoppers again are a group that has many different ways that they can feed and produce many different symptoms. So the sharpshooter leafhoppers, they're going to produce this watery fluid that they flick from their body. The ones that feed on the mesophyll, they're going to produce stippling. And then there are ones that feed on the phloem. Now, if you are an insect that feeds on the phloem, these will almost never produce a visible uh, symptom of injury to the plant uh, from the feeding event. Now, they will feed and remove large amounts of fluid from the phloem over time if you have large numbers, and that will produce secondary things like wilting and the like. But you won't see a spot because they are precision drillers that are trying to access the fluids of the phloem and keep the cells intact so that the fluids will flow to them. So the phloem feeding species use their mouthparts uh, very delicately compared to the others, very precision feeding. So again, that picture of the aphid I showed you before happens to be an aphid on the right, one we call a green bug. But anyway, you can see the meandering track of the way the stylets are going in. They can go between cells. They're not killing cells, and they do not want to kill the cells of the phloem where they ultimately reach. Instead, when they reach it, the tip of the mouth parts opens up enough so that the fluid can just flow right into their body, and they don't even have to move anymore. Insects that feed on the phloem, they can stay in place maybe for the rest of their life because the site is not killed. They're just taking in these phloem fluids. Now, if you have a phloem feeder, there are other things you'll see. You won't see, a spot, but you'll see honeydew. And honeydew is a sticky fluid that is produced as a waste product of an insect that is feeding on this very sugary material, this watery sugar. So most of what comes in comes out as this sticky little fluid called honeydew, um, and they will collect on a droplet of a leaf and might have a little shine to them. And honeydew is something that you can you can watch for. You see something a little shiny, it just doesn't look right. Suspect some sort of insect that's feeding on the phloem because that's their waste product. A typical place where people will find honeydew might be after parking their vehicle under a tree that has some sort of honeydew producer, say an elm tree, has some aphids on it, or a cottonwood tree, or whatever, and you come back and the windshield of your car or your hood of your car has got all these little shiny droplets all over it. And most people will then look at the tree and blame the tree. I mean, you know that elm tree is dripping sap on my car. Well, that's being unfair to the elm tree in this case, because what is on your car had been sap from that elm tree at one point, that point that we see illustrated here, where the insect is accessing the phloem and the fluids of the phloem. But that has since gone into the body and has then passed and was last seen at this point. And now we call it honeydew. When it comes out the back end, after it's been partially digested, now it's honeydew, this sweet material full of the extra sugars and the water that they have extracted from the phloem. So here we see a plant that has honeydew on the leaf, and it also has those little white flecks. Those are the cast skins. This is a pepper leaf that I had in my uh, greenhouse a couple years ago, and hadn't been paying attention, and went out one day, and the sparkles are what caught my attention. Then I look closely, I see the white skins on it, and it's got to be aphids. I mean, where are they? Look on the leaf above it, and there's where the aphids are. So usually the honeydew will drop straight down. Most all honeydew producers, the honeydew just drops onto the surface underneath them, and they're continuously excreting this. And of course, their old skins will be discarded and they'll drop down too. So these leaves with sparkles and honeydew and the cast skins, I mean, they just provide just rock solid kind of diagnostics for this situation. It's got to be aphids or some honeydew producer. And aphids I have been mentioning as big honeydew producers, and they are around here. If you see honeydew, almost always there's aphids producing it. But another common group around here would be insects we call soft scales. Uh, there's groups of insects called scale insects, and some of the scale insects feed on the mesophyll, and some of them feed on the phloem, the ones that call the soft scales. And those are the two big honeydew producing groups that we have here in Colorado. But if you were to go a little to the south, going to Texas, going to Florida, Southern California, then you're more into whitefly and mealybug country. And then there's some minor groups that produce honeydew, psyllids, some of the leafhoppers I talked about. All of these are insects that suck sap from the phloem in the way that I showed you with that aphid that is accessing the phloem with its mouth parts. They're all in the order Hemiptera. So these would be, again, some examples, some certain kinds of soft scales, mealybugs, whiteflies, psyllids, all honeydew producers. Now, also mentioned this before, that wax is something that is produced by some insects that um, feed on the phloem as well. There's uh, the case that I mentioned earlier, though, in terms of excreting, was only the one in the middle, in the lower part, where they excrete wax. So the one in the lower part is the a leaf covered with that psyllid sugar, we call it. So again, in a couple of cases, instead of honeydew, it's converted to wax, and it may then uh, cover the waste. So in the case of the psyllid, it's a little wax-coated sugary pellets. Um, Now, not all of them make it quite as easy. Just I don't know how many examples there are of this habit I'm going to talk about here, but uh, I have an issue with a soft scale on my house plants. It's called the brown soft scale, and it's mostly on citrus for me, but it's on ficus and it's on ivies and schefflera. It's on lots of commonly grown house plants. But again, I've got a bunch of citrus because I'm trying to be the citrus mogul of northern Colorado. And I'm looking at my plants, my citrus plants, and uh, I've got some soft scale on them from time to time, and I see strange things happening. So that picture on the left, there's honeydew on the underside of a leaf, and I look at that underside of that leaf. I look at that leaf. There's no scale insect. I can't find it there. It's not there. No, it's on the leaf underneath it. And in this case, here's a excuse me, here's one here on the stem of the citrus plant, and there's the honeydew. It's over here. It's 2 inches away. That's because this insect, and I'm not sure if how many others have this ability, but they have what's called an anal cannon, and they can direct the honeydew. They can shoot it some distance away from their body. So yeah, one of these you have to look around. It could be within 2 or 3 inch radius of wherever you see that honeydew. Now, a couple other things that come with honeydew is wherever it lands and persists, uh, it will support the growth of a group of fungi called sooty molds. So these are fungi that grow on honeydew contaminated surfaces. They are not a pathogen. They are a mold that grows on the honeydew. And if the honeydew is on the leaf, they will grow on the leaf. And they may make the leaf appear unattractive, and they may cut down a little on photosynthesis by blocking the light, but they're not a pathogen. It's not a powdery mildew. And the sooty mold may grow on other parts of the plant. They may grow on the branches, like in this case, these American elms in the oval at CSU, and that's because the upper surfaces are surfaces that will intercept the dripping honeydew that's coming off an insect. In the case of American elm, it's a scale insect called the European elm scale. But it could be an aphid. You see a plant that looks abnormally black, and right today the leaves haven't come out on the trees yet. You can see trees that look black, and that is a tree that has a history of some aphid or soft scale or other honeydew producer, um, because that's sooty mold. It tells you something. That's a plant with a chronic honeydew producer situation of some kind on it, because the bark is black, and it doesn't need to be on the tree. It's wherever the honeydew lands and persists. So often it might be on the sidewalk. So the little aspen there on the right, a little grove of aspen, to the drip line of that tree, the sidewalk is abnormally black. And that's because that tree has a chronic situation with aphids. Aphids on aspen are very common around here. And you might see sooty mold growing on upper branches of the same plant, but it's also growing on the sidewalk. Again, excellent diagnostic for a honeydew producer is that, and it can be unattractive, and sometimes that's the problem. In this case, we have an area of concrete, fairly recent building. When the picture was taken, very quickly, the area underneath this tree turned this kind of gray, and that's because this is a tree that supported a honeydew producer, an aphid, the linden aphid in this example. Very tough to get it off. You have to scrape it off. So sometimes the issue with the honeydew producer is that the honeydew is a nuisance, and furthermore, the sooty mold that grows on the honeydew is a nuisance and makes things unattractive. And another thing is that this honeydew will be attractive to other insects. So you will see honeydew on a plant, and then you will see a lot of other kinds of insects visiting it. Lots of things will feed on sweet materials like honeydew, flies, some beetles, and then wasps and bees. But probably the most consistent ones you'll see, at least on some plants, will be aphids and producing honeydew that is then attracting ants. So, with the ants and the aphids, they have a mutualistic relationship where the aphids produce honeydew, which is highly favored material for for ants, excuse me, and in turn, the ants will provide them protection. So you will see ants actually physically amongst the colony of honeydew producers, tending them and providing them protection. So again, they're feeding there, and the ants are collecting the honeydew from the aphids, taking up the little droplets, so intonating them and until they want to give something up. And when they do, they take it in and until their crop is full, and then they'll return back to the colony. But this is the value to the ants. They get sweet material. And then for the aphids, which are essentially a totally undefended kind of animal, they get protection. Everything wants to eat aphids, and the ants give them some protection. So, say a lady beetle comes in into this, then the ants will drive it off. And so sometimes we have problems with persisting longer than they would because the ants are interfering with these natural enemies. Anyway, that's the main points I wanted to cover. And so I hope this gives you a little bit different perspective on how to look at plants. And again, this is more of a diagnosis oriented type of topic than the way I normally do the program. So I hope you're all staying well and enjoying yourself and maybe getting out. Hope you get a little gardening in. That's what I'm trying to do. So good luck.